So I've gone over how to actually make the parts, and then how long you actually let them sit on the bat. That's going to be something that you have to decide. And then getting them off the bat, I like to cut them off before they start getting stiff, so as they shrink, there's no stress on that joint. But these I didn't do that with, so just going to run the knife onto the bat, underneath the form until it pops off like this. Now, this is kind of stiff, and I talked about how this joint is always going to show up if you do medium or large shards this way. You're always going to have some kind of problem here unless you can throw that, paddle that, thin that out. So I made it, like I said, a little thicker down here than the actual walls of this piece. So the walls are a lot thinner. If you see how it flares out here, both the bottom over there and this top part have that clay, extra clay, to be able to paddle down and meld that joint so it doesn't show up, but it still can show up a little more. So I like to do it so you see how I can handle this. It's not flopping. That's kind of where I want beginners to start, or Clay 2 students to start thinking about things, or Clay 3 students, until you get control of it. When it's a little wetter, you can throw it a lot more, and if you throw it after you put it together, that joint also kind of dissolves into the spiral of your compression lines and your throwing lines. So that's a couple things to think about. Now, because it's stiffer, sometimes when I make them, I don't actually score this area because it's so wet there, so I can throw it, and I don't even score and slip. But since this is a little stiffer, I got to score and slip, and I want you to think about the bottom and top of your form to score and slip it. These scoring ribs are kind of crap for that. Maybe I'll do it a little with that, but they really don't open it up as well as maybe a scoring rib with larger teeth, or a bandsaw blade that has bigger teeth. But a fork, a metal fork, works really well if it's a sharp fork. So go to Goodwill, pay 20 cents for a fork or something, and a fork can open up that surface really nicely to get it to that point where you're kind of back to that throwing part. And again, I always talk about paintbrushes rather than my hand to apply the slip, so I don't get the crap all over the surface of my piece. I don't want like gooey slip marks everywhere, okay? So a lot of questions come up during this time. It's like, how long do I wait so it's at that state? And you know, each environment, humidity-wise, is different. What I found in this studio, if I throw them at about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and I come in at 7 or 8, so about 12 hours just sitting out, not under any of these vents, because the vents will dry one side but not the other. So you know, make sure you put it in a good location. On your shelf with plastic over the shelf, they dry slower, but about 11 to 12 hours out gives you a pretty stiff form that you're not going to manipulate too much when you do the process. But I actually like lately, because it's winter, it's different than when it's summer, so the timing is something to think about. And I like lately around 6 hours. In my home studio, I can do it overnight, because my home studio has no ventilation blowing at all. There's no movement of air. It's just radiant heat, and so they dry really even, and they dry slower because I turn the heat down at night. And so the hotter it is in the room, also they dry quicker. All right, so I've slipped and I've scored. I'm going to put that sucker on there. Move you closer here. And, you know, because, again, you're using the bat as a measuring device, this joint should line up pretty well if you pick the right bats, right? So as with all scoring and slipping, you want that to mesh a little, so you might twist it back and forth. What you may have noticed is like how you put the bottom onto the wheel after you've taken it off. You center it on the wheel like you normally do by finding that centering whenever my finger hits it. I'm going to move it away from my finger. Different ways to figure out how to get it in the center. Because you want this, you don't want this area here primarily. This is the most important part to center right here at the joint. Down here it might be a little bit off, and that's okay. Up here is where you're going to be actually wanting it centered, because you're going to be throwing this area here, okay? So after I get it centered, I'm going to take lugs of clay, and if you look at how large these are, you don't want to use little bratwurst-sized pieces. You want to use like a baguette-sized piece to hold a larger jar on. So as you scale up, you use different size lugs. And once it's centered, you can knock it off center by putting those lugs down, so do remember that, okay? So I'm going to put them on and push them down onto the wheel head a little bit, all three. So use 3, so 3 points of pressure, cause an equality of pressure on it, and holds it really nice and firm. Once I get those onto the wheel head, Then I'm going to start pushing those, watch my thumb, down towards the jar, and that's kind of a way that it chucks it on there. So you can use chucks too. You can throw chucks, and there's a variety of different ways to do this. So after I have it on there, I get it slipped and scored. I'm going to get on the inside and on the outside, and I'm going to pinch that joint together with that thicker part of the clay. I'm going to pinch it. I'm going to pinch it all the way around. Sometimes I make a mark on the shoulder of the jar after I get it around once. But I want to pinch this onto the jar. If I have too much slip, I'm not moving the clay, so I don't want to have a lot of slip on the surface of this, on the inside or on the outside. So remember that. You want to use slip liberally when you do slip and score, but you don't want to have it on the surface because you're trying to move that clay. And if you see what I'm doing with my thumb, that is a good way to move it with my thumb. I'm going to show you another way with a paddle next. So there's different ways to approach how you get this joint starting to be tight. You know, pushing down on it like this, making sure that the top is pushed onto that bottom, and getting that pinch together. Now, there's also movement like this. And if you look at the ongi potters that I've shown you, if you've done any research outside of other ways to make medium-sized or large-sized jars in parts like this, then there's a variety of different movements. There's the paddle and anvil. I'm just going to show you paddling, but you can use an anvil on the interior. That's the actual curvature of your jar, and you could be hitting it against that. And I think that's one of the best ways to really compress that joint. So let me get a paddle, and I'll get on to showing you how you paddle this surface. In different sizes, you can actually have a texture on the paddle. We have some with rope around them. You can carve the wood, and then maybe that's the way you actually manipulate your surface a little too. But I like to paddle downward first with my kind of anvil hand on the inside against. And that downward paddling, I'm hitting it, is actually moving the clay in a similar way that my hands were, okay? And I'm moving my hand a little bit. I'm not going to over accentuate it, but I'm moving my fingers like this as I'm paddling. So I'm moving up on the inside and down on the outside. And there's no right way or wrong way, like I've said many times. There's just another way to do it. So I'll do that once or twice downward, and then I may paddle back up a little bit. So if you remember back when you started making pinch pots, that movement and pressure in the clay is one way that you're getting the clay to join itself. Now, if you look, it's getting to that point where it's getting closer. Some people start like giving up at this point, and they just rib that line away, but I guarantee you, if you don't do some kind of manipulation after this, that joint will maybe come back, okay? So my next step is to go on the inside, and I'm going to I like to use a wooden rib more, but all I have is this one. So I'm going to use a wooden curvature on a rib to move it as I would use my hands. That's just another way. So I'm going to get in here like this, and I'm going to make a mark a little bit on the shoulder on this other side, and I'm going to come to that mark, and I'm going to quit. So I don't do more in one spot, because I want to try and keep this even. So I'm moving that clay again, that thicker line of clay, and what's occurring at this joint right now is it is a little softer there, and so it's bellying out slightly. And that's one of the things, if you do this at a wetter stage, you'll be able to really change the shape. Right now I kind of threw the shape the way I kind of wanted the shape. The first one I did for you, that browner clay, and we'll see the difference between how I threw it initially and how I put it together and then threw it further. And you'll see that the shape has changed. All right, my next step, if I were throwing it, which this one's not really that throwable, I'm going to actually need to make sure there's some lubrication, but I don't want water for my lubrication to flood the bottom of this and cause any cracks, okay? So I'm going to use a sponge to get the surface wet without it being drippy. So I'm going to get in there, and get the area that I want to actually slide my fingers or my rib or whatever against. If I'm using a rib, I use less water, and I didn't drip any on the bottom. If I did, then I need to get that off because of that thing I talked to you about, standing water in the floor of your piece causing possible cracking. After a night out, but throwing up when you're throwing is kind of how you normally throw, right? But then there's a downward throwing that I can do to kind of, again, move that clay back and forth and get it to know the other part and kind of meld that joint. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to go from up on the inside and go down towards the joint now. And I could do that a little while longer, but because it's a demonstration, I'm going to use a rib and try and rib this out now and shape it a little bit there so that there's fluidity in the form. And my favorite rib for this is a more stiff rib, like a stiffer big steel rib like this that I can still bend to the curve, but it's not that floppy, crappy rib that comes in the beginner kit. So I'm going to go like that. I'm going to bring it up. And in a way, if you see what I'm doing, I'm still kind of throwing. I'm still manipulating the clay, but I'm also doing a reductive thing to the thickness of that area. I thinned it out quite extensively when I threw it, but if I can reduce it a little when I'm shaping it, that can help me too. All right, that's about it. So there's a lot more to the other ways that I talked about throwing in pieces, where instead of throwing them right side up and upside down, you do that reverse with the bottom and the top. And again, if we just take a 30-pound piece or 20-pound piece and make a big bowl, the coil technique of adding a coil, throwing it, or just starting out with a patty, as I discussed and showed with honky potter. So there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way. It's just this is probably the easier way to start out. And so that's why you're trying this. So these jars that you're making, again, you're going to think about the surface. It's not going to be just this simple jar. It can have a lid, but again, that's not a necessity. So any questions, don't hesitate to ask and hit me up. See you next class.